On this episode of The Blue-Headed Stepchild, I speak with Miriam Shoenfield of ReThink 35. She's with an organization that opposes the Texas Department of Transportation's plan to expand the biggest road that runs through the city of Austin. TxDOT's plan is expected to cost over $4.5 billion and last over a decade. So it's a big plan with a big impact that's going to affect a lot of Austinites for the years to come. Check it out. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Blue-Headed Stepchild. I'm your host, Sam Lee. Today, I'm here with Miriam Shoenfield. She is a board member for an organization here called ReThink 35. Miriam, if you would just introduce yourself and your organization and what it is that you guys do.
Sure. My name is Miriam Shoenfield. I'm with ReThink 35. ReThink 35 is an organization that has been fighting to stop the proposed expansion of I-35 through Austin. So TxDOT has planned a giant widening of the highway, more than doubling the number of lane miles through central Austin.
Okay.
And there are many problems with that, which is why we are fighting for a better plan. And we're really also pushing for a proper study of alternatives to be done. So everyone agrees I-35 right now is near the end of its life. It needs to be upgraded and modernized. But there are way better things that we could do with that right-of-way than have a giant highway plowing through the middle of the city. So we're also pushing for a study of alternatives.
Right. And so just to clarify, TxDOT, meaning the Texas Department of Transportation, and the organization or the state organization that oversees highways, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And so are they the main decision maker on the other end? Are there any other parties involved, or is it basically just like them playing the key role in this?
The decision-making structure around it is actually kind of intricate. So the way it works is that the governor appoints some people to what's called the Texas Transportation Commission.
Okay.
And they essentially make the decisions and they sort of direct TxDOT on what to do.
Okay.
But there's some other players. So this is a federal highway.
Right.
So the U.S. Department of Transportation also has a role to play. However, there's this complicated arrangement between the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Texas Department of Transportation where there's basically been an agreement that the Texas Department of Transportation will take responsibility for the roadways in Texas. And so for this particular roadway, there's not the kind of federal oversight that you would have in a lot of other states. And that's part of the problem.
Interesting. Okay. Because the I-35 itself, right, is about, 60 years old. It kind of post-World War II, the introduction of automobiles, and then there was the big federal program to build all these roads, right? So it's federal money, a federal program that built it. But what you're saying nowadays, the oversight is quasi-state.
Yes, essentially. Yeah. And that's a really interesting, the history of interstates in general is really interesting that you just brought up. President Eisenhower started the interstate program, and the program was intended to build interstates, and the word literally meaning interstate. So it was not, the highways were not supposed to run through cities. They were supposed to go around cities. And in fact, in this book that came out recently called City Limits by Megan Kimball, she finds some archival material which there's a discussion between Eisenhower and some of his advisors. And when Eisenhower and the advisors find out that interstates are being built through cities, they're really upset and frustrated because the point was to, for interstate commerce.
Right.
And cities are a terrible, terrible place to put a highway because cities are congested and there's a lot of density and activity. So for various complicated reasons, which maybe we'll get into later decisions were made to place interstates through cities, and that's generated a lot of the problems that we see today.
Right. And so Austin specifically, let's talk about the history of where that got placed and why, right? So it does go right through the middle of Austin, right? It's kind of the main artery that goes through the middle of the city. Today's city, right? 60, 70 years ago, what did that look like and how did that end up to be?
Yeah, so the history of the I-35 highway in Austin is ugly, to be quite frank. Before there was I-35, there was a beautiful boulevard called East Avenue.
Okay.
And what happened was that in 1928, the city came up with a master plan, and the decision was made to move all Black and brown people east of East Avenue. So various practices took place, redlining and so forth, that basically required everybody that wasn't white to move to the east of East Avenue. In 1948, a lot of those practices became illegal.
Right.
And 2 years after that, funding was available to put a highway in the Austin area. From an engineering perspective, the placement placing it on East Avenue did not make any sense. There were various problems involving a bluff. I don't know all of the details. But there were social and political forces at play that wanted the highway there to solidify a racial segregation line at a time when a lot of the segregationist practices were no longer allowed by law.
Okay. I've heard that the width of the East Ave was like ideal for a highway. Is that false narrative, or is that just kind of a byline?
I haven't heard of that. I have read some, original source material about some of the discussions about the placement, and the engineers claimed that that placement was problematic. But so I don't remember where in West Austin it was going to be, but it was going to be from the engineering. The engineers wanted it somewhere in the West,
right?
And there was huge pushback. People refused to have a highway near them, and so that's why it was placed there. But I haven't heard the thing you mentioned, so that's something I should look into.
So you're saying it's mostly racial segregation-ish sort of thing?
Yeah. And also just the fact that, white people didn't want highways polluting their air,
Right.
So there was both the intent to segregate, and then there was also the decision about who would bear the brunt of the impacts of having a highway nearby.
Right. Okay. So we've got this highway that was federally built, goes through the middle geographically of the city now. And now the Texas Department of Transportation is looking to widen, not just widen, but lots of other type of air quotes enhancements, right? Different projects that they've got going on with it. Is it possible that we've come so far down this road of, like, no pun intended, autocentricity, that we're so reliant on these cars now that this is what we need to do, right? And we aren't this, little European town where I can walk everywhere and bike everywhere. And I need to take my car places, and I need to get on 35. So when I came here today, I came from Southeast Austin. I came up 35, right? I got off on Airport, came this way. And if I wouldn't have taken 35, I think it would have been longer. And the argument, I suppose, that's being made is that it would have been even quicker if I-35 were enhanced, wider, all those sorts of things. So I guess my question is, are we too far down that pathway, or is there still time to change and rethink the way is 35?
So the short answer is we're definitely not too far down the pathway if that means we're in a situation that's irreversible. So if you think about car dependence and car centrism as like a spectrum, we're somewhere over here.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have a choice about whether to move more in this direction or more in that direction. We're not going to, remove car dependency through one decision overnight. But so many of our planning decisions are based on what direction we're taking things in. And expanding highways, it increases car dependency and car centrism, but it also wouldn't make your trip here any quicker. I also had to take I-35 to get here. That's the situation that we live in. But we know we've got over 70 years of data that shows that expanding a highway never, not once, actually relieves a region's congestion problems.
Explain this to me, right? And I believe there's a term for it, like maybe a scientific term where it increases demand. Is that what's going on? Simply that you make the highway more attractive, wider, so and so, and now demand increases. For more people want to take it, or more people think it will be quicker. Is that what's going on?
Very close.
Okay,
so the phenomenon is called induced demand.
Induced demand.
Induced demand. So what happens is, say you've got a congested highway and you add some more lanes to it. So, the day it opens, there will be less congestion than there was before. But within a couple years, those lanes will fill up to the same or worse, often case worse, congestion levels than they had before. And there are many reasons for this. So part of it is just that, when you open up an opportunity, people take it. So there are more people that will choose to use that road because there's more space available. But the effect is actually quite wide-ranging, because what it also does was it is impact the way that development happens. So developers will see, this extra lane capacity is being added on the highway. So now I'm going to build a development even further out of the city because I know there will be space for people to drive into the city, instead of, say, building development closer to the urban core. So a whole bunch of development patterns, developers are looking at what's happening with the road and making decisions about how to develop on that basis. So oftentimes by the time the road is constructed, there's a whole bunch of extra need for the highway that wasn't there before.
Right. So it essentially sparks sprawl.
Yes.
Right? And so if people have a way to get into the city, there's incentive for the developers to build further out, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And the whole sprawl issue is very cyclical. There's a kind of positive feedback loop, because then what happens is you've got all of these additional cars coming into the city. Now you need more space for them in the city. You've got all of these cars. Now you need parking lots for them to park. That means everything in the city starts to get further apart. That means people in the city need to drive. So then you have more cars, and then you need to widen the road again. So it's this perpetual cycle. And that's why we end up in situations, cities that have really embraced this way of developing, like Houston and Los Angeles, have gigantic highways and traffic nightmares that are never ending.
For example, the Katy freeway, right? Like this is often like the big comparative study that people point to as a nightmare, right? It's was it like 25 lanes wide or something? But it's just as bad, or if not worse, from the expansion. And I mean, is this a good example?
Yeah, the Katy freeway is a perfect example of what happens when you expand a highway. So yeah, it's about 26 lanes wide, one of the widest in the world. And after it was expanded, peak commute times increased by about 40%. Because of the whole phenomenon of induced demand that I was describing. Increased need for that roadway was created, and so congestion got worse.
That's crazy. So up 40% by the time your commute, it got wider, and then the commute time increased 40%.
Correct.
Is this like well-documented scientific data that, like, why is that ignored? If that is fact, why is that ignored? Like, why can't TxDOT look at that objectively? I imagine TxDOT was part of that project, right? It's a big state freeway. What's the incentive? Is it, I don't know, explain it to me. I'm not asking a question here. I'm just trying to get my head around it.
It's a great question.
Right.
I don't think there's a simple answer. So the first part of your question is this fact? Is this data? Is this controversial? And the answer is yes. It's fact. It's evidence-based. It's not controversial. TxDOT, when push comes to shove, will admit that this project will not alleviate congestion.
Right. So then what's their next line? It doesn't alleviate congestion, but...
I'm trying to stay as close as possible to the sort of language I've heard them use. I think they would say that it enhances mobility.
What does that mean?
What that means is basically more people will drive. So
roads enhance mobility. Great. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about mobility, the only way to be mobile is in a car, and you think mobility is a good thing, people moving around is good, it increases economic productivity and so forth, then you'll think that the way to enhance mobility is to make more space for cars. Even if everyone in the cars has just as long of a commute and is just as miserable as they were beforehand,
right.
You've increased the cars on the road. And I've been at meetings at the Texas Transportation Commission, and an increase in vehicle miles traveled is regarded as an achievement. It's here are our great achievements of the year. We've increased vehicle miles traveled by blah, blah, blah.
Right. Look at everybody using our product.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how do we rethink 35? What are the alternatives? What do you suggest because like you said at the beginning, 35 is problematic, right? So regardless of how we got here, it is currently problematic. And I guess somewhat kudos to TxDOT to say we have a problem and they're trying to fix it, even though you would argue that they're going about it the complete wrong way. And so what's the alternative?
So there are many alternatives, and our position is that there should be a full study done of several alternatives. So I'll just name a few.
Okay.
One is that you fix the problems with the highway without making it bigger. That's the simplest alternative to expansion, is to not expand. So there are safety improvements that need to be made. There's issues with some of the ramps. So there are lots of things that could be done to make I-35 better that don't involve making it bigger. Making it bigger makes a lot of the problems worse. A lot of the safety problems, for example, are a result of the number of lanes. When you have more lanes, you have more lane changes, you have more accidents. So anyway, that's a boring alternative, but that is one alternative.
Right.
Is you fix the highway without making it bigger.
Sure.
Another alternative that was proposed by a group called Reconnect Austin involves a full burial of the highway. And so the idea there would be that genuinely interstate traffic that's trying to, get around the city, would go underground. And then the surface level would be an urban boulevard that you can build on top of. You can have, a regular street, essentially.
Okay. So bury, literally tunnel.
Tunnel.
Okay.
Tunnel the highway.
But don't we have geological problems with trying to do that? I know the Elon Musk boring project, right, was essentially that idea, maybe not for the interstate, but for other traffic patterns. And there's tons of limestone around Austin, and it's really prohibitive to tunneling. No?
I don't know the answer to that.
No.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with the WeConnect proposal, other than in this very general schematic. And then the ReThink 35 proposal is to basically reroute the interstate traffic onto existing highways around the city. So, many of the groups working on this understand that we need a place for people to drive who are, going from Mexico to Canada.
Right. Because 35 goes from, was it Laredo to Minnesota or something?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. No,
exactly.
It's literally just a massive corridor for a lot of transportation, right?
Absolutely. But, what I-35 does in a lot of Texas cities is it goes around the city, not through the city. And that's what a lot of cities have. They have a highway that goes around the city, because we've heard from truck drivers, they hate the fact that they have to drive through Austin. So we have a roadway, State Highway 130, that was built intentionally to be a bypass for Austin. The problem is it's not utilized very much because it's very heavily tolled.
Okay.
So one possibility would be to make SH-130, turn that into the interstate, make it an attractive bypass option. And then we don't need a highway facility running through downtown. The road that is currently I-35 could then be converted into something that makes a lot more sense and that carries a lot more people in an urban context.
Okay, so what does that look like when you say you want to encourage them to take SH-130 and say TxDOT is on board?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the reality of that? Are they reducing tolls for truck drivers? Kind of like, what are the mechanisms that would go into play?
So, yes, somehow or other, you would need to have tolls reduced or removed for people who are making non-local trips.
Mm-hmm. And okay, and what's the reason for the tolls? That the tolls were kind of to pay back the people that built the road to begin with. So would it eventually or essentially just be like a subsidy, right? Like maybe they still get paid back, but the government is paying for it instead of the people that are using the road?
There are many ways it could be done. Some people have talked about a designation switch where basically the road that goes around Austin is free and then the tolls move to a different road.
Okay.
But, other things that could be done are, the state could essentially just buy out the debt on the tolls. That would still be less expensive than the I-35.
And so that's what I was going to say, right? Like how much is proposed for the I-35 expansion?
It's close to $5 billion.
$5 billion,
yes.
Right? And how much do they owe for the, SH-130? Probably less, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So it would still be cheaper if they wanted to do that. But there's also creative things you could do. Like you could toll people who are making local trips, but make it free for people making non-local trips. And so there are other ways that the finances could be worked out.
Right. And so that works for, say, truck drivers that are going cross country. But going back to our original at the beginning of this about me and you taking 35 on the way here, right? 130 would be way out of the way.
Absolutely.
Right. So how would that work? What would be the reality of that?
Well, if we had an urban boulevard instead of I-35, I mean, we could have all kinds of forms of mass transit on it. We could have buses, we could have light rail, we could have, bike lanes. So that's one of the problems with highways through city is that they're actually not efficient at moving people like you and me across complex environments that cities are. And so with a boulevard instead of a highway, you'd be able to move way more people in a much more efficient way than having every person in like a big metal box taking up a huge amount of space.
Right.
So there would be you'd need a much better and stronger transit system, but that can only live in a space that makes sense for it, and it can't live on a highway.
Right. And so when you say boulevard,
Mm-hmm.
what's this vision? What does that look like? I just imagine like trees and everybody's happy and we just go walk down the boulevard and get an ice cream, right? That sort of thing. But you're saying other ways of mobility, right? So I think of public transportation, bike lanes, pathways, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it? Like, is that what should be thinking?
It's really up to our imagination.
Okay.
So here's the thing. I mean, I-35 takes up an enormous amount of space, and the land that it's on is some of the most valuable land in the state of Texas. So if we as a community could come together and think about what is the best way for our community to use that space. The sky is the limit. So, of course, mobility is going to be a very important part of it, and bus lanes, bike lanes, in addition to car lanes, are going to be important. But, we could also put land into a community land trust, which would guarantee affordable housing, especially to the communities that have been most harmed by this highway. There could be businesses and ice cream shops and trees.
I don't really like ice cream, to be honest with you.
Well, I do. So
No.
So yeah, I mean, it could become a beautiful space, a space that attracts people instead of a place that people want to avoid like the plague.
Right. And interestingly, now I'm thinking about it, like a big problem that they're having with what is it, the Project Connect, right? The public transportation plan is where to run these lines, right? But if you already have this space, right? Say you take a lane out of what is currently I-35 and create public transportation on that, I imagine the cost for these projects goes way down, right? Like you already have the concrete, you already have the publicly owned land, and you're literally just kind of putting in a rail line, right? Like that sort of thing. It's very simplistic,
from a financial perspective, one of the things that's interesting about highways is that they sort of financially kill an area. So there's no economic productivity happening on the highway itself, and all the land around the highway has depressed land values.
Right.
So one of the things is like if you had a boulevard with homes and businesses, it would generate a ton of tax revenue that we're not currently generating. And it could help pay for things like rail and better transit and all kinds of stuff. So there's a real, the Strong Towns movement actually makes a very strong economic argument against highways. The Strong Towns movement.
Strong Towns, okay. I'm sorry, go ahead. It creates there's a strong
economic argument against highways and sprawl-oriented development,
right?
Because it's really not financially sustainable.
Right.
The developments that are happening very far out of the urban core don't generate enough tax revenue to pay for themselves or the roads or the pipes or all of the infrastructure that goes out there.
Right.
And so the current path we are on is not financially viable.
Right. And speaking of like economic viability and that sort of thing, like I'm going back to TxDOT wanting to make this happen, right? And are there economic incentives for the decision makers at TxDOT? Like, is there money sitting in a pot, or is it federal grant money sitting in a pot that if they don't use, they lose, and people on the board are related to contractors or have, like, is this true? Like, I imagine this is, but like...
Yeah. If you follow the money, you will find the path to highway expansion. So, ultimately these decisions come indirectly from the governor. And if you look at the donors to the governor's campaign, you'll see owners of contracting highway construction companies, oil companies.
Right.
The people appointed to the Texas Transportation Commission have connections to, car industry and all. It's all there.
Yeah.
So there are huge incentives financially for the governor and the various people he appoints to, the phrase he sometimes uses, turn dirt. So it's just like build, 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 build. And that's a real problem because it harms our communities, and our communities should not be the sacrificial lamb to make money for construction companies.
Sure. And so talk about that, the harming communities. And so displacement.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you're doing this construction, I know actually where I used to live off Waller down by Community Beach down there. Festival Beach. Yeah. They're turning that into a staging ground.
Yes.
And so to be clear, this is an 8 to 10 year plus project.
Yes.
Right. And so there's over 1.5 acres of parkland, right? That is going to be turned into basically just a construction staging next to the river.
Yes.
Where I used to take my dog down there.
Yes.
Is going to just become construction materials, right? And then I guess through eminent domain, people will lose houses, businesses. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So through eminent domain, TxDOT is taking people's homes and businesses. And, the pattern, we talked about the history of I-35 and the sort of discriminatory practices that were at play in those original decisions. And a lot of that same pattern is replaying itself today. And it's not just in Austin. These patterns are happening all over the country. But here, 86% of the displacements are people who are people of color or lower income. They're in environmental justice categories. And so once again, the most vulnerable communities are bearing the brunt of the impacts to this project. And another really important thing to keep in mind in terms of the impacts to the community is the effects of a project like this on our air.
Okay.
So the Austin area is now above the threshold considered safe by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency.
I got a notification on my AccuWeather the last 2 days.
Yes.
Actually, it's funny because like the last couple of weeks, it has said good or like average. And then the last few days, it just went straight to unhealthy.
Yes, it was like, do not go outside.
No, it was like above bad. It just said unhealthy. I was like, okay. Yeah.
Yes. And this is actually, ironically, Air Quality Awareness Week. So we all got to be very aware of air quality issues. Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so what will I-35 expansion, what kind of effects will that have on just environmental impacts, specifically air quality?
So particulate matter, or PM 2.5, is a pollutant that's very harmful to human health. It causes lung disease, exacerbates asthma, heart disease, and various neurodegenerative diseases as well. And it comes from cars and trucks. So some people think that all the air quality issues will be addressed once we have electric cars, but that's actually not the case for PM 2.5 because a lot of it comes off of tires and brake wear.
Okay.
And electric cars are heavier, and so actually more friction more particulate matter comes off of the tires because of the increased weight of the cars.
Okay.
So this is a real problem. Our region is now essentially in what's called non-attainment. And doubling the size of the highway is, doubling its capacity. And so there's going to be way, way more cars, more pollution. And the communities especially in East Austin, within the project area, some of them are already have higher rates of asthma and other health conditions that make them particularly vulnerable to the impacts of air.
Right.
There was actually a family in my neighborhood. I live pretty close to the highway that had to move because their kid's asthma was so bad, and the doctor said, like, you just got to move.
Really?
Yeah. So it's a very serious problem, and it strikes at something so fundamental and primal. None of us choose whether to breathe.
Yeah.
So we have to advocate for making sure that the air we breathe is breathable.
Yeah, and it's not like, put up a fence around your house and just like that sort of thing. You're forced into it, right?
Exactly.
And it's not, for many, many people, it's not as simple as just moving, right? Oh, you don't like it, move away.
Exactly.
Like a lot of people don't have that option. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's the problem. How do we change it? Right? I know what the suggested ideas are and what the vision is, but what is your organization and what can other people do to stop this?
Yeah. So there's a lot that can be done, and we're pursuing many different avenues. So
Okay.
One thing that we're doing is filing a lawsuit. So we filed a lawsuit against the Texas Department of Transportation over this project. We've also filed a civil rights complaint. People who are interested can learn more about those and donate to support them because they're very expensive, the legal action, at ReThink35.org. There's a lot of information there. So the legal avenue is one way. But there are also political ways to intervene on this project. And actually, this Monday, a very, very important vote is taking place at our regional planning organization. So that's called CAMPO, and it's the 6-county region that includes Travis, Hayes, Williamson, the areas surrounding Austin. And that regional body actually allocates funding for these projects. And so our council members are actually putting forward a motion this Monday at Campo saying, please do not release funding for this project until appropriate environmental studies are done. And so that's a decision, so part of the advocacy is also around our city council and our Travis County and our neighbors in the surrounding communities and towns and ways of impacting how the funding streams go.
Okay, so Campo, CAMPO.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a little-known organization, but it is incredibly powerful and matters so much for the way planning happens in this region.
And that is comprised of local officials?
Yes, there's a 22-member transportation policy board.
Okay.
And it's mostly elected officials from the towns and counties in the area. So there's some Austin City Council members, Travis County commissioners, and then, there's the mayor of St. Marcus in Round Rock and Georgetown and so forth.
And they play a role in decision-making, and how do they interact with TxDOT? So, for example, do they provide recommendations to TxDOT? Do they actually have real authority to stop things? Are they a voice? Are they a way to amplify the message to garner, public support? What if Campo comes out and says, we're all against this, we don't like it, then what?
Then they stop the funding from going for it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
they can withhold funding.
Okay. And so is that probably the best thing that you have at your disposal is getting Campo on board to stop this?
I would say it's one of many different avenues we're pursuing. I don't want to rank them.
No, for sure. But it seems like the most immediate, right?
But it's very immediate in that, a vote about this is happening on Monday.
Right.
And it's very interesting, actually. So the reason that we have these funny organizations that are not city, not state, not county, but kind of something in between, it's partially because there was a huge backlash after all of these urban highways were constructed. So many neighborhoods were destroyed. So many people were displaced. So many communities became segregated that the federal government realized that urban areas needed a voice in these decisions, because before that, it was just like coming down from the federal government and the state. And MPOs were created to give urban areas a voice and some power in how planning in urban areas developed. The way it is now in our metropolitan planning organizations and in many across the country is that the urban core, even though most of the people live there, they have the minority of the votes on these boards.
Okay.
So the majority of the people in the Campo region live in Travis County, but the city of Austin and Travis County reps combined have a minority of the votes. And that makes things complicated.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because people have different motivations, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the people that will suffer most directly from the air pollution of this highway and who will be displaced by this highway and so forth are people living in Austin and Travis County.
Right.
But
whereas
a lot of
somebody in Bastrop, for example, could say, oh, this is actually great for us and we would like to push forward with this, right?
Yes. Whether it is great for them, is
no, it was just
is unclear. But there's all kinds of forces at play,
right?
Which make the politics of this complicated.
Yeah. Speaking of politics, it's my understanding that pretty much all of City Council is against this, but the mayor is in favor. You giggle.
Yeah, well, it's...
Right? Is that correct? I'm pretty sure Clerk Watson is for it.
It's close to correct. Okay. So the first city council resolution that raised concerns about this project, it was a 10-1 vote, and the mayor was the only one that voted against the resolution. The mayor was involved in the creation of this project when he was a senator.
Right.
So I think he has some attachment to it. But yeah, the city has been speaking in a pretty unified voice. And as I mentioned on Monday at Campo, our city delegation will be speaking in a unified voice about their concerns about this. So a lot of this is about how much power the city has in relation to our metropolitan planning organization, in relation to the state. So those are some of the forces at play.
Yeah, local control, right?
Exactly.
Right. Okay. And so anything we're missing? So you talked about people can go to the website to donate to help with the lawsuits. We've got the Campo meeting coming up. Is there anything else people should know about and ways to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would just recommend to people is, well, first I want to recommend this book. Again, it's such a fantastic book.
Megan Kimball, City Limits, Infrastructure Inequality, and the Future of America's Highways.
Yes, and it, Austin and our I-35 fight is mentioned, but it really gives a lot of the historical context, and it's also just a great read.
Okay.
So I highly recommend the book. I'd also say, we've been talking a lot about the technicalities and the legalities and this board and that board, but the ReThink 35 organization, we're an all-volunteer grassroots campaign, and we also just have a lot of fun together. So another thing that people can do, if you go to the website, we have monthly social events. There's a Discord server that people can join. So it's really a community of people who are really dedicated to fighting for a better outcome for the city and for the planet. And so, yeah, I'd encourage everybody to just check us out and get involved if you're interested.
Yeah, for sure. And I tend to go down the technical route. I come from a policy background.
Yeah.
And I always want to know the mechanisms and the reality of it and kind of, the next steps and that sort of thing. But you're right. There's a lot that can come from just spreading awareness and social advocacy and coming together with like minds, right? And maybe the person that has the solution isn't part of the organization yet, right? And just needs to be brought into the fold and get their voice out there. And maybe that's where that comes from, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. All right, Miriam. Well, much appreciated. Can you just mention the website one more time? Where can people find out more? And yeah,
rethink35.org.
Okay.
Lots of information and ways to get involved.
Perfect. Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah, thanks,
guys.